Hi, my name is Lisa Pugh. I am the Public Policy Director at Disability Rights Wisconsin, and I'm providing updates on Wisconsin's planning for the Every Student Succeeds Act stakeholder process for the Advocacy Institute. You've maybe seen some of my updates before. This is the third of 6 meetings that we are having in Wisconsin for this stakeholder process. You likely have a similar process in your state, and if you're not aware of it, you should see how you can get involved to make sure that the voice of students with disabilities and their families is part of this really important planning process for school accountability that will definitely be impacting students with disabilities. So in our third meeting, we really started out discussing the landscape in the state regarding data about achievement for students with disabilities, the first time that we really dove into that. And some interesting data that I think really helped to get the process started, and hopefully we can put some links up to these actual handouts, was really something that disability advocates definitely know, but oftentimes other stakeholders don't, is really how heterogeneous the group of students with disabilities is, and that we should really have high expectations for achievement of all groups of students with disabilities, because the research tells us that they all can achieve proficiency, with the possible exception of that small percentage of students with very significant cognitive disabilities. So this breakdown, there were a lot of questions about that from other stakeholders in the group about how the subgroup of students with disabilities breaks down in the state, and how really achievement can look different depending on the subgroup, but that students with disabilities aren't just one homogeneous group. We also talked about where students with disabilities are in our school districts, and realizing that rural and declining enrollment districts tend to have higher percentage of students with disabilities. So there's some overlay with poverty in the concentration of students with disabilities across our state. And then finally, I think what we all knew from the beginning is that achievement gap. These orange tabs here show you the achievement of children with disabilities as compared to blue students without disabilities. And so kind of brought that point across that we do have a chronic problem. We've had it for years, and it's something that really needs to be addressed in our accountability system. We also talked about how students with disabilities live in many different categories. They can be ELL students, they can be talented and gifted students, then of course they fall into different ethnicity subgroups. And so it's important to understand the different groups that students belong in. They aren't just students with disabilities. So that kind of started our conversation today. And we kind of then moved into discussing this U.S. Department of Education guidance that you can find on the web, non-regulatory guidance using evidence to strengthen education investments. And we really just kind of got started thinking about what does ESSA require of states in terms of the types of interventions that they would be asking local school districts to be applying. And a really basic description is that they will be required to be implementing strategies that have some level of evidence. One of 3 levels of evidence is what is outlined in this guidance. Interventions that have strong evidence, moderate evidence, or promising evidence that can demonstrate a rationale for effectiveness. And so we were kind of talking about a little bit today about how the state might go about choosing the types of interventions that they would promote to districts, and how districts might make those decisions to meet local needs. One thing that I think is important when thinking about students with disabilities is a lot of intervention strategies that are out there have not been researched, including students with disabilities within the cohort. And that's problematic, because if students with disabilities are the subgroup that a school district really needs to pay attention to, then we need to know that the evidence demonstrates that a particular intervention is actually effective with that group of students. And then if you drill down into subgroups, is it effective with a particular subgroup with which a particular district has an achievement problem with? And so I think that's something that school districts will, struggle with, and the state might struggle with in terms of making recommendations. In this particular guidance, it suggests that states should go to the What Works Clearinghouse to think about what sorts of evidence-based interventions are out there. And I, suggest that you go there too. And unfortunately, in a brief review, there really isn't a lot out there that shows you that there is evidence in effectiveness specifically with a subgroup of students with disabilities. So I think advocates will have to bring those ideas forward and make sure that these particular type of strategies that are going to be funded and implemented and resources targeted toward them really address the subgroup of students with disabilities. We also talked a lot today about fidelity of implementation. So just because a school district identifies a particular strategy and decides to invest in that, are they really on a path toward implementing with fidelity? And that was a concern that a lot of people brought up, and is certainly something that we've seen here in Wisconsin. For an example, with implementation of positive behavioral interventions and supports, we do have some technical assistance and districts that are attempting to implement PBIS, but some of them are doing it with fidelity and some of them aren't. And we talked a little bit about the implementation science today that says when doing a strategy, if you're doing it with fidelity and with implementation planning, you have an 80% success rate with that particular strategy. Whereas if you don't put any effort into implementation planning, your success rate can be as low as 14%. So we talked about that being a priority in Wisconsin is certainly something that's a priority for people who are advocates for students with disabilities. And if you see in this Department of Education guidance, that's something that in the steps of the process of identifying local needs and actually coming up with a strategy of choice, that we talked about maybe moving this plan for implementation up near the second step of the process. We also talked a lot about funding as a concern. Do local districts currently have the funding and resources to ensure that they can implement with fidelity? And I think the answer was pretty much a resounding no. And we've had flat funding in Wisconsin for special education for 10 years. And so that is a concern of districts. It's a concern of the state and how we can ensure success with this process. And so, but one point that I brought up was that even when we have had higher levels of funding for special education, we still have those achievement gaps for students with disabilities. We haven't made more progress even when we've had more funding. So there is something that we can do in terms of changing the culture in our schools and changing the way that supports for students with disabilities are structured. I brought up today, just the silos between general educators and special educators, and how really changing who owns the student, shared ownership of the student is really important in order to address achievement gaps. Ensuring that students with disabilities actually have access to the general education curriculum can bring us a long way toward reducing that achievement gap. So I think that's one of those hard conversations that we need to have in states about having effective ESSA plans. We didn't talk at all about interventions that don't work, and I'm hoping that's something that will come up in future meetings. Things that are happening in schools that we know impact the achievement of students with disabilities: suspensions and expulsions, bullying and seclusion and restraint, other sorts of interventions that we know aren't working that we really need to monitor to make sure aren't happening as we implement the evidence-based positive strategies to improve achievement. Finally, a big part of our conversation today was about parent engagement, stakeholder engagement, and how stakeholders, we need to do something different. We need to be engaging stakeholders at all steps of the process, from that initial identifying local needs to choosing the implementation strategies, to ensuring proper implementation, to evaluating the quality and success of particular strategies, and then regrouping as necessary. And we also talked about how our traditional, parent engagement and outreach really isn't working the way it needs to in order to, have parents as full participants. I mean, we really need buy-in in this program, buy-in from teachers and other educators, administrators, if this is going to work. We also need buy-in from parents. So how can we rethink what parent engagement is? Parents of students with disabilities, very busy, have complicated lives. What we're doing now traditionally isn't working, and we will spend some time thinking about how to change that. And finally, we ended today by talking about our homework and how we might help with the next steps of the state plan development and implementation, and really talking about how we can have a plan that is equitable. And so hopefully in our next meeting, which will be in January, I'll be able to give you an update on that. So I will talk to you after the next meeting. Thanks.